everyone. And a warm welcome to the members who are able to join us today. Our membership chair, Amy Schoen, is here. And we just have a little something for the ladies that were able to come. Eliane Banoun, could you stand? Welcome. We have Gina Corbo, right there. Can you stand, Gina? Welcome. Thank you. We have Valerie Spears. Could you stand? Welcome. Thank you so much. Thank you. And we have Eileen Cole. Would you stand? Welcome. We hope to see you at many more functions in the future. I just want to say a few words about our guest speaker, Tamsen George. She has had a career in cultural education and historic preservation. She currently serves on the board of directors of the Falmouth Historical Commission. She is the former president of Museums on the Green in Falmouth. She served as executive director of the Shirley/Eustis House Association. Just as an aside, the Shirley and Shirley/Eustis House stands for British Royal Governor William Shirley. Tamsen has held other positions, such as head of public programs at the MFA and manager of the Schools and Communities Department of the Massachusetts Cultural Council. It was while she was involved with the Shirley/Eustis House that she became interested in William Eustis. She did extensive research over a period of 10 years, which resulted in her book, The Life and Times of William Eustis. I've read the book and I recommend it most highly. In addition to being most interesting, it serves as a reminder of the tremendous sacrifices so many courageous individuals made in the founding of our nation. It is my pleasure to introduce Tamsen George.
So there are no slides, so I gave you a little sort of cheat sheet that you would have by your place. And so as I talk about it, you'll see the pictures of a couple of the people involved. Now there are so many stories that I can tell you that I discovered in writing the course of this book. I started writing it because I had I wanted a project. I'd never written a book before, but I decided I would. I was the executive director of the Shirley Eustis House, and people do ask, who was Shirley Eustis? But it's really, as you were told, it was William Shirley and William Eustis that the house was named for. So I got involved in it as executive director there and doing renovations and the site. But we didn't know anything about William Eustis particularly. And so I had raised some money to have a book written about him, and then I retired. So then after I retired, I started reading history, and I don't know where I am on this, but the history books were all about Washington and Jefferson, and I got kind of bored with reading about brilliant heroes and superior fellows, and so I started reading for a broader picture, and I looked into the history of the American Revolution from the other side, including materials written by the British, and I read bios of Aaron Burr and Benedict Arnold, and the strange things were that this mentioned their bios mentioned William Eustis. And I realized suddenly that I need to clear my karma because I had raised money to have a biography written of him. And after I retired, it had not been done by my successor at all. And so I kept reading and I kept running into William Eustis. So I decided it seemed like a sign and I'd better pay attention to it. You know, you get those things sometimes and you know you're supposed to do something about it. So I did. Now, I've never written a book, but you know, you take it on. And I didn't know what was involved in writing nonfiction. And I found out the problem is that it has to be true. And it has to be documented. You know, so you got to then do research. And you've got huge questions to answer if you're going to figure out what motivated a guy that lived 250 years ago. So the ones they write about, Washington and Jefferson and Adams, all have huge collections of papers that are saved up about them. Eustis didn't have any. The other guys knew that they were doing something remarkable at the time and cared about their heritage, so they saved their papers. And their heirs and wives and everybody saved, their secretaries saved what they had. So you could go through it. I mean, Hamilton's wife spent her whole life after he was killed making him into a martyr and covering up all of his little romantic dalliances and so on. And we just don't hear about those. But this did not get me to Eustis, and I had to understand that the world of Boston in 1775 was a different place. It's a different country. They do things differently. They thought differently. They had different expectations and lifestyles. For instance, they kept the chairs against the walls of the room because it was easy to sweep the rug in the middle. We don't know that. Communications were different. Nothing traveled faster than a horse. That was it. If you wanted to get a letter to Europe, it would take about 6 weeks. Yeah, so you have to hope that the ship got there. And I also realized that, you know, really it's not the founding fathers that created this nation, but the common people who believed in their concept of liberty. The founding fathers were our elite bunch with the plans and the theory about equal rights, but it was the common people who lived it, got dirty, and fought the war. They were not paid. There was no money, but were given food and clothing when it was available. But they believed in it, this primary idea, their belief that they were Englishmen and had the same rights as Englishmen was what irritated the British. The British thought those Americans were peasants beneath them. And that was one of the main issues that you don't understand, is that the way you perceived each other. So they called us Yankee Doodles. And when you think about the song, they were not happy with us. They were making fun. But we took the song, made it into a marching song, and said, ha, so much for you. But I needed to find out what Eustis did and what he thought. And that meant trying to find his correspondence. He had no direct heirs. He had no children. And no one saved his letters. His wife, Caroline, followed Martha Washington's example and burned all of the personal correspondence. And she just says, not there. I have about 2 letters from her. So it took me about 8 years to pull this together. And I was just saying, it's good to have a project. So I had excuses to go places and talk to people and travel and, you know, look around. I found one letter at the State University in Louisiana. How it got there, you know, came out of New Orleans. And I realized that the underlying concept of this book and this guy's life was allegiance and loyalty and devotion to a cause and belief in the future. And it's a question of what was loyalty and what was treason. So I was going to talk to you for a few minutes about that because I got into it. The founding fathers and the good guys in our Revolutionary War were devoted to the idea of liberty and freedom from the mother country, England. But when they wrote the Declaration of Independence, something we do not think about is that they became traitors to the mother country because they were part of this country. And by saying, no, we're not doing that anymore, they became, in effect, traitors. And then, so I talk about Benedict Arnold now as our most famous traitor. As some would see it, Arnold switched sides and changed his mind to spy on the British. And in doing so, he became a traitor. But you have to see it that he became the traitor by doing that, but on the other hand, he could have renounced his traitorous position as an American and become a loyal British citizen again. So you get into these weird questions. So unfortunately for Arnold, later, the British do not accept traitors, even though we don't either. And so no matter how much he tried when he did go to live with them, they never paid attention to him and they never gave him the rewards that he wanted. He died a pauper. But some people get committed to an idea that benefits the whole, everyone, and some people are committed just to their own advancement, personal wealth. Benedict Arnold was an achiever at the cost of others. Washington thought he was the best fighter we had in the Continental Army. And it was Arnold who made the difference at the Battle of Saratoga to make France come in on our side, which made all the difference. And the only reason we could win that war was that we had France as an ally. We also don't usually acknowledge that very much now. The hidden Arnold, on the other hand, was flexible in his commitments, and he went where it was to his own advantage. He was impulsive and he developed resentment. He had not gotten sufficient recognition from Congress for his heroic fighting and his injuries. He got badly injured a couple of times, and he didn't heal well. He got wounded in the left thigh, recovered from that, got wounded again in the left leg, and his horse fell on him. So in the end, he ended up wearing a 2-inch heel in his left boot because he was that crippled that his leg healed shorter by 2 inches. So he recuperated for a year, and he was given the assignment as governor of Philadelphia. But then after that, Washington asked him to go back into duty as a soldier and to lead a regiment. Arnold said he was not well enough. He still had this injured leg, and he could not spend the time on a horse. He would, however, be happy to be commander of that big fort up on the Hudson River called West Point. So Washington thought it over and thought, well, yes, the fort does need rebuilding and we want to improve it. We want to add some more redoubts and things like that. So he thought, okay. So he says to Arnold, all right, you can go up there and be the commander. And Arnold had thought, however, in his little secret soul, that it would be more lucrative to work for the British. He could trade West Point to the British for an officer's position in the British Army and a whole chunk of money. And that appealed to him greatly. And part of the background on that is that during his year off in Philadelphia, he, who was about 40, he got married to an 18-year-old, Peggy Shippen, who was the belle of Philadelphia society. She was privileged, she was clever, and she was very expensive. Now, Arnold already had several children and a sister he was supporting in Connecticut. His wife had died. So a month after the wedding, he starts talking to the British. Now, we know that Peggy helped as a conduit for messages and letters and so on. This was the third year in the war. My subject, William Eustis, was posted to a house that had been a Loyalist house and estate, and they had turned it into a hospital. It's Robinson House on the back side of your flyer there. And you can see it on the map, sort of in the lower right. This was a lovely country estate, and it was great for a hospital because they could put all of the wounded and sick in the barns. And they could have the office in the house. Doctors could live in the house and so on. So Arnold took command of West Point, and then he decided that Robinson House would be the place to live. Eustis lived there. But Arnold figured it was a good place for his family, better than living in a fort, you know? And he arrived with his own guards. He had a lifeguard company with him of 100 men, and a boatman with 8 boatmen, and a private launch. his young wife, Peggy, and her slave, and her nurse, and the new baby would arrive later in Robinson House. So you get a whole household moving in. Now, they didn't make the doctors move out, which was a very nice thing. Otherwise, they would have had to move in the barns as well. Now, it's hard to think about why he turned traitor, and we wonder if it wasn't his wife, or maybe these insults by Congress who did not give him a medal for the times he was wounded. So he wasn't recognized, and this was a guy who liked to be recognized, and he wanted to be celebrated. So we also wonder if it was maybe just his ego that did this to him. Now the whole plot, where it all came down, happened at Robinson House, and it was revealed by chance. George Washington had decided to meet with the French up in Connecticut, and he was riding back home down toward the Hudson River in New York, and he said he would stop. He sent a message and said, "I'm going to stop at Robinson House for breakfast." Okay, they say, good, we'll expect you. The night before, however, unknown to everyone, Arnold had met with John Andre. This is all right in this little thing. It's like chess moves when you try to figure it out. I had to go over it and over it. He'd come up the river on a ship conveniently called the Vulture. I love it. And he couldn't get back to the Vulture because the colonials on the shore had shot at it. So he had to come back down to Manhattan overland on a horse. So Arnold wrote him a safe passage letter, and they took him across the river, and they disguised him by giving him another jacket so he wouldn't look so much like a redcoat, covered up. And then he was riding back on his horse. They loaned him a horse, they got him the stuff. They had a guide, but the guide quit, and they said, "You can go the last 20 miles on your own." So we did. But he was stopped by 3 guys who were colonials. They were sort of independently connected to the militia, and captured. And they found, because they got him to take off his boots, they found the plans of West Point, the fort, in his stockings inside his boots. So they send a message to Washington. And they send a message also to their general, Benedict Arnold, saying, "Did you write a safe passage for this guy?"
I'm so sorry.
Yeah, so they... Anyway, Arnold gets the message at breakfast that morning. Yeah, why don't we plug it out and I'll just talk. Arnold gets the message that morning at breakfast. And he's sitting down with William Eustis, and a person comes in and says, "Here's your mail, General," and so he goes through the packet of letters.
Can you click yes here? We'll move your table down. You can come closer.
Oh, okay. Oh, I actually do that? Okay. Sure.
Can't hear you. Yeah.
Oh, I can't. Oh, I'm sorry. It's outdoors. That's the problem.
Can our camera see? Yeah.
Oh, well, we
Very close to
adapt.
the camera now.
We adapt. I'll try to make sure you can hear me out in the back row, so to speak. So everyone's sitting at breakfast in Robinson House. Orderly comes in with the mail for Benedict Arnold, and he opens his packet of letters, and he suddenly leaves the table and runs upstairs to see his wife Peggy, who is there upstairs. And he comes running back down the stairs. He runs out of the house and he says to them, "I'm going to West Point." Okay. When half an hour later, Washington comes up with his entourage, including Hamilton and Lafayette. They come riding up, and they come in and say, "Okay, where's the general? They expect to be welcomed." And he's not there. And so they say, the orderlies in the Robinson House say, "Well, he's gone to West Point." So General Washington says, "Well, actually, I'd like to see it, so I'll go over there." So he goes down. This house is right by where there's a ferry landing. So he goes down and he goes across to look at West Point. And when he gets there, there's nobody there to welcome him, which he thought was really what was going to happen. Nobody welcomes him. And he realizes the fort has not been improved the way he was expecting. And so the whole thing is a mess. Meanwhile, this is like a soap opera at this point. Meanwhile, the men left in Robinson House, including Lafayette and Hamilton, hear our girl Peggy up on the stairs screaming. She's shrieking. She's having a major fit. So they run out, the young men, Dr. Eustis and the two other men, and they go up the stairs, and here's Peggy. She's put on a transparent negligee. And she's tearing her hair, and she's having a fit on the stairs. And so they're just very upset. They don't know what to do with this lady. And so they think they've got to maybe carry her into her bedroom or something. That she resists and she fights them and everything else. So then they send for General Washington. So he comes upstairs and he sort of takes one look at this crazy lady and he says, I'm out of here, you know. I'm not doing this. You have to deal with her. So the young men, they're all, Lafayette, Eustis, and Hamilton are about between 22 and 25. And they are totally taken in by this. She's now 19-year-old in her. So they carry her into the bedroom, and Eustis tries to get her quieted down, you know, to do this. And meanwhile, the young men go down, and at that point, Washington gets a packet of letters. And it says that this guy was picked up with a permit from Benedict Arnold to cross through the lines. And Washington, and that he was found with the plans of West Point. So Washington realizes right away that something is very, very wrong. Meanwhile, she's screaming upstairs. So he has to then call in the other guys. And what they do is they immediately change the commander, and they change out the companies around the fort to make it safe, because they know the British can attack and that Arnold has set it up to be captured. And then upstairs, Eustis has to quiet down Peggy Shippen. And the whole thing kind of goes down at that point. So they go down the river and they try to catch Arnold. But he's got a head start, so he gets down to Manhattan. They're so upset with Peggy Shippen screaming and carrying on that they tell her it's okay, she can leave. So they bring up her carriage and they kind of get her packed up and they put her in the carriage, and within 2 days she's gone and out of there with her baby and her slave and her servant, and they're all, so the whole thing quiets down again. So they just, you know, it's just one of these interesting things that you find on these episodes where you don't know you're going to run into this. And so it was fascinating to me because Peggy Shippen knew very well what she was doing. We found out later that she did, because in letters she wrote and when she stayed with a woman that actually later married Aaron Burr outside of Philadelphia. I mean, these guys are all in this thing. And so they find out that she actually did know what she's doing, got herself back to Philadelphia and the protection of her family there. Her father was a very prominent Tory in Philadelphia, so he had lots of contacts and so on, so she was pretty secure when she gets back there, you know, so that's what she did. Now, I don't want to take any more of your time particularly, but I'm happy to talk about anything if you have any questions about things you might wonder about. I absolutely adore this period of time. I've been wallowing in it for about 10 years. And in looking up for this book, I found that I got very interested in the side characters, because all of these people were not the ones we most often hear about. They're the ones that were doing the work. And we don't celebrate them as much, that were into actually doing it. The founding fathers planned it, but they had to have cooperation and people to pull it off, or it wouldn't have happened. And I realized it's not unlike the Patriot group that began to believe in this cause is not unlike what you do in a nonprofit group, where you have a cause, you get together, and you work to make it come out. So you could say you're modern day patriots. It's the same kind of idea. Anyone have any? Yeah. Oh, yeah, well, see, Arnold makes it safely to Manhattan. They award him by saying, you can be a British general, and he does. And he's a general for about a year, and he takes a regiment of British and he goes in raiding in Virginia. And he actually burns Richmond, Virginia as part of this. And he goes, but then he later leaves New York after the Battle of Yorktown. He leaves New York and goes back to England. He gets Peggy, goes back to England. He gets Peggy out of Philadelphia and goes, and she comes out on her carriage herself. And he leaves from New York on the same ship that Lord Cornwallis goes back on, and he's the defeated commander at Yorktown. So I mean, these characters come in like this, and to try to figure it out, just to try to figure out who was doing what where, kept me, I'm drawing diagrams, just to keep track of who's doing what. Yeah.
Well, first of all, thank you. I enjoyed your presentation so much.
Well, it's just one character.
Some memories of history. But I want to ask you, can you make any modern day comparisons?
Well, one thing I found out, which is kind of fascinating to me, which I hadn't realized, because I didn't know all this stuff, and I'm just coming across it when I find it. Our two-party system started in Washington's administration, which I had not realized. I thought it came after that. No, it started then, when he just started setting up things in. We were in New York first, not Washington, but the general. And it ended up that their ideas of setting up the government, and Hamilton wanted a bank, and some of them thought, no, we don't need to have a national bank that's controlling too much. You're trying to control our money. We don't want to have that. So they ended up having right away two different points of view. And Washington and Adams and Hamilton were on one side, and Jefferson and Madison, and actually Dr. Eustis, were on sort of the other side, which is sort of more, a little less conservative. And they called themselves Jeffersonians because they followed Jefferson's idea. They later became the Democratic Republicans. And Washington's group, of he and Adams and so on, became the Federalists because they wanted a strong federal government. And Jefferson, whose experience was in plantations and stuff, thought cities were bad. You don't want to have any central control. You want to just kind of let the people chill out. And he's like the biggest hippie ever when you read about him. So it's just very interesting. I didn't know that. I didn't think it started way back in 1783. So.
Interesting. You referred to him as Dr. Eustis. What kind of doctor was he?
I'm sorry?
You referred to the gentleman as Dr. Eustis. What was kind
Yeah,
of
well, he was a doctor.
What kind of doctor?
I'm sorry?
What kind of doctor? A medical doctor?
Yeah, that's the kind you had. Although, you could call yourself a doctor however you wanted. There was no requirement to become a doctor. Generally, you found another doctor and you served as an apprentice for 2 years. And in that 2 years, you would read whatever books he had, and he would teach you how to make medicines in his lab or on the corner of his office table, So it was a very, not so much what we consider education today, but it was practical. It was hands-on. You would go with the doctor along on house calls, and that's how you learned it. Now, there was a medical school established in Philadelphia right about at the time of the war. Ben Franklin thought, it was a good thing. But the European education was different. In Europe, they had medical schools, and you went and you got theory. In what became the U.S., you became an apprentice and you just did hands-on to figure it out. So, and I would kind of rely on the old lady down at the end of the road because she knew the herbs. And she would know a lot more, perhaps, about medicine. So they didn't really have a lot of faith in the doctors. They were called surgeons because they would be needed to cut off something. And that might save your life, though, really. It might, if you had a cut, there was no education about germs. I used to say third graders know more than doctors did then because they know to wash their hands. And they didn't, so you could get gangrene in, and gangrene was a real problem for them. So they did amputation because it was the only way. So, not always very attractive, this stuff you get into. You don't want to read the details. So anyway, thank you very much. Yes, I'm sorry.
Eustis was eventually the governor of Massachusetts, wasn't
I'm sorry, I can't hear you.
he? Eustis was eventually the governor of Massachusetts.
Yes, he was. He was a doctor, and then at the end of the war, he went back to Boston, and he got interested in, he went back to become a doctor again, interested in education. He was put on a school committee in Boston when they were trying to figure out how to do schools. And then he became a local representative in the State House in Boston. And then he ran for Congress, so he went to Washington and Congress, got to know James Madison, who was involved with Congress, and James Madison asked him to be Secretary of War. And then we have the War of 1812. So he's Secretary of War for the War of 1812, which was not particularly successful. And then he's asked to be an ambassador. So he goes as an ambassador to the Netherlands. I mean, who knew? So, you know, he's sailing across to the Netherlands at the end of the War of 1812. And he's there for about 4 years, comes back, goes back into Congress, and then he runs for governor. And he dies in office because you didn't have any social welfare, you didn't have Social Security. If you didn't make the money, you didn't have money, and he didn't have people to protect it. They didn't have people to take them in. No, you had to make the money, and if you spent it, you were in trouble. You'd go into the poorhouse. But so he kept working. All of his life he kept working. And so he died in office as governor. His portrait is up in the State House. But it's interesting because I didn't realize that you had no fallback position. I mean, if you lost your money, you lost your money, and unless you had a family relative you could go live with, you were in trouble. And that's another whole issue for women. I got interested in women's lives, but that's another whole thing.
Two questions now. The first one, or secondly raised one, about his wife, whether she came from a wealthy family. Did she bring anything to the marriage, even though she was a woman?
Yeah, see, this is the interesting thing also, because the women would have everything that they had went to the husband. The woman, and we see it in our wedding ceremony now, the woman is taken down the aisle by the father and handed to the husband. And any money, any property she has, everything goes to the husband. And that's it. So he married a woman much younger than him. And I don't know if she had any particular marriage settlement. Oh, I'm sorry, I don't want to pull that off. And so she was, as I say, she outlived him 40 years afterwards. They were married about 13, 14 years. And so she was about 30 years younger. And she married a guy that gave her an interesting life. He took her to Paris, he took her to the Netherlands, and he took her to Washington and so on. So he was a friend of her father. And I wondered if there was something, you know, here's the daughter getting to be older and she's approaching 30. You know, we might make a deal here. But I can't find anything on it, you know. You gotta find the paperwork. I can't say it because it's not true and documented. But, so you have to think about this kind of things. But women they could not vote, they could not own property, they could not handle money. I don't want to get over time, but the only thing that I could find in the law was they had a thing called the widow's thirds. If you were a widow and your husband died, your son would inherit or your daughter would inherit, and that meant her husband would inherit. But you were guaranteed 1/3 of the property. So you got one room, and in one sort of arrangement, one woman was guaranteed 3 apple trees in the orchard. You got 1/3, you got a portion of the garden so you could grow your own food. You got the rights to use the kitchen, and you got a bedroom. You know, so that's how they took care of the old ladies. Somebody had to take them in. Now, if your daughter was the one who inherited, the son-in-law, he would then run the place. And if you didn't have a good relationship with him, he could rent the house out. But you're guaranteed your room up there. So you know, you get into this and it's kind of interesting. So.
Which raises the second question: where and how did you do your research? Were you able to find it in Falmouth? Where did you go to?
Well, you do your research by uncovering stones. You read a lot of books. You read their footnotes, and that you read the footnotes, and somebody say, "Oh, they got that from there. I should go look there. I didn't realize they were letters from that person. I can go look at their letters, and they might have some to William Eustis." So you're looking for letters, and in the letters you sometimes get a good, you know, a sense of the person, of what they're writing about, you know. So, but I went down to New York Historical Society. This was kind of fun. Another girlfriend and I, we went down to New York for the week. We thought I was gonna spend maybe half a day there. I spent every day that week at the Historical Society because they had a nice librarian who said, you know, we don't have this on microfiche, but we have a folder of real letters. I mean, you know, the authentic stuff, but nobody's gone through them. Do you want to look at them? Yeah, I do, you know. And there were 27 letters, and they gave me another whole lot of insight into his life, which opened up other things. So, you know, that you know, you just don't know. So it's all chance. It's like going to the beach and uncovering stones. And you might find something and get a lead, you know, something else. I don't know. Anyway.
No trips to England? Did you travel to England?
No, I went to France because he had been there. I have been in England, but because he had been to Paris. And so I knew what street he had been on in Paris and where he and his wife at that time stayed, so I could go and they look the same. I mean, it hasn't changed. At least in this area, it hadn't changed. They hadn't redone the boulevard or anything. You know, that goes by here, but this road was over here. And I could find the district and the whole thing. So, you know, you can do that, and so you get a sense of the atmosphere a little bit. Great excuse, you know. Sorry, research, have to do that.
Why did he get sent to the Netherlands?
Why what?
Why did he get sent to the Netherlands? Why did he get sent off to the Netherlands?
Why did he get sent off?
To the Netherlands.
As ambassador?
Ambassador.
Yeah, because the Netherlands was just a new country right then, and they had no ambassadors from the U.S., so they asked for one. And he was a friend of Madison's, very good friend of James Madison. Went down and visited him. You know, his wife and Dolly were pals. I don't want to keep you any longer. So thank you very much. We'll talk another time.